Okay, let's continue in Candy-chan. I want to start on the rifle. I got the large version of it. One thing I want to talk about before we continue. One thing I realized lately is that I always thought of not having a fully formed plan before I start as a shortcoming in my painting. But the more I think about my own painting and the more I learn about teaching miniature painting, the more I realize that this approach to painting can take away a lot of anxiety about starting your project. The two premises are that you don't need to have everything planned out before you start, and you can always correct things you don't like. A painting project is alive, it's always evolving, so don't forget to stop, analyze, and don't be afraid to adjust if needed as your project progresses. So, we're going to apply this to this weapon, and the premise is that I don't really know what I want to do with it as far as details go. I know that I want to have the upper part black or dark at least, so probably this whole length is going to be dark. I'm not sure yet about the back part, but at least the upper part of the part back here is going to be black too, or dark. And then have most of the lower area as well as the magazine. Yeah, just be a variation of white with some stripes, with some detail maybe painted on. I do know that I want it, banged up and scratched. That's the premises that I'm going into this paint job with, and the rest will just evolve. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that happens. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on why I'm going to change things up. And so what the goal is and what I don't like and what the solution is to get to that goal from something that I maybe don't like as much. Okay, it took me a while to find this color, but I think this is what I want to roll with. As you can see, there's a bit of blue in there, a bit of green, mostly through Dark Reaper and a Nurgling green, and a little bit of black. Okay, that's my initial sketch. Like I said, I wanted just a tiny bit of variation in the elements. So brighter area up here, darker area down here. And you can see as I turn it around, I also sprayed these edges slightly brighter than the ones next to it. And like I said, just a subtle transition. I didn't want to have any major transitions. We're going to make them, or major value differences. We're going to make them more intense now with the brush. And also, like I said, I want a lot more color variation in there. So yeah, let's do that. I'm going to clean everything up, and then we're going to work on the white. Okay, so the whole pre-shading looks a bit clinical, almost artificial. So what we need to do now is give this whole thing a bit of life and liveliness. So I have Dark Reaper and QB Darkness on the palette, which are both blue, because like I said, I want the overall theme to be somewhat blue, or at least have some blue in it. Then I have a brown, some dryad bark, because while this is not as red as, for example, vine oxide, yeah, so a bit of a brown variation, and we will see, since the blues are a bit colder, probably use a bit of brown to counter that and make it warmer in some areas. I also want to paint an orange highlight somewhere, so the blue is going to be obviously a good complementary contrast to the orange. You know, orange and teal, always interesting. We will see how it works out. Using this mix of blue and black, I started to apply a wash, and I wanted it to both stay in the recesses to darkline my panels, and also to create initial shadows or make the initial shadows that I sprayed more prominent. Now this didn't quite work out, so what I did, I was using Flow Improver, and you can see that on the palette the colors are spread out more equally, covering the area more equally. I was using this mix for darklining the panels, and it did work quite good. I made sure that everything was outlined and distinguished, such as the cable that was running across the outside of the rifle. When I was trying to increase the contrasts on the panels themselves, the mixture did not quite do what I wanted it to do. The goal was to make these darker areas towards the edges darker and leave the areas towards the other edges brighter. So it was pushing the pigments towards the darker side to make what I did with the airbrush more intense and to get more contrast within the panels. However, the mix with the Flow Improver was acting weirdly, and I got a lot of coffee staining, as you can see. So I started a fresh palette and put out all the colors that I used again. And I also added some dish soap to the palette. It is right above the colors, and I'm taking a tiny bit of it and I'm mixing it into my dark lining mix. And using that mix, I'm trying to paint over the areas that got too much coffee staining and to make these areas more equal. So I tried to use the Flow Improver. In my case, it did not work. I'm sticking to dish soap to break surface tension and to get more equal coverage. Everywhere I have some coffee staining, I'm just quickly going to clean that up. You can see I can cover that pretty nicely. And again, you can see that I'm pushing the pigment away from the brighter area to the darker area, as always. Yeah, surface tension gets decreased way better with this. Oops, that's a bit too steep maybe. Okay, so again, we're cleaning up these gradients now. So I'm mixing a bit of white into the mix, and where I feel like it's too dark, I just add a layer of that. So like here, it also helps me to clean up some of the dark lining. Having mixed the midtone gray, what I do is I clean up all the panels, all the panel gradients with a few glazes of a midtone, which unifies the gradients a bit more, which also means I need to highlight up those panels again, but I want them to be more unified, more smooth again. You can see the glaze consistency in the vertical lines that I paint on the side of the ammo magazine. And I clean up some dark lining, and at the same time I'm starting to highlight, for example, this round edge on the side, which doesn't have a clear line, so I have to put in some interpretation, and I'm just painting this darker highlight line that I'm going to be refining later. Mixing in more and more white now. I just keep doing the same thing, highlighting edges, unifying some gradients, and highlighting more edges. This is going to be a gradual process, repeating a lot of the steps as I analyzed the piece and tried to bring everything up to the same level of contrast and smoothness. So excuse me if there's some repetitiveness in the footage, but I want you to see the process as I gradually work my way up to the final result. It's important not to just use white in the end to create our textures. I'm starting right here with this highlight color to put in texture and scratches. It will look more natural in the end, it will create a gradient, but it's also going to look more realistic because there's going to be deeper scratches that are going to catch more light and not so deep scratches and dents that will catch less light and that won't shine as bright as the very deep ones. So I'm using a darker gray here, again, to unify my gradient a bit with stippling, but also I'm already painting in lines, drawing lines that are going to resemble scratches and imperfections in the gun. We don't need to paint a consistent layer, we can always blend with dragging out lines like these. And then maybe mix it up and change direction. And then drag it out even wider. And our brain is going to do the work for us, and it's going to look blended. And at the same time we do add, like I said, some texture. I'm going to do the same here. At the same time I'm going back and forth with midtones as I see the need and to clean up some things. Like I said, painting is a living process. I just look at what I already painted, I analyze, and I just bring everything up to where I want it to be. And sometimes while I'm already edge highlighting, that means I need to unify a few gradients again, make a few gradients smoother, put in more texture, and so on. As I'm progressing, I use more and more white for my highlights, and I always start at the edges, you already know that, to see how much my value changes and what else I need to correct, as you saw me do it before. Sometimes I feel like I need a gradient to also be brighter to adapt to the new value contrast situation. And just using combination of lines, of traditional glazes, of stippling, I just bring all of these gradients up a bit brighter. You can see whenever I have a line showing somewhere, I just work on that transition on that line, and I just use a midtone to tone it down again and bring it in line with everything else. With every new layer of a brighter highlight, I'm putting in those lines again. This is another layer of lines. Sometimes I just make existing lines brighter, and sometimes I put in new lines. Again, this is to simulate that there's multiple layers and multiple intensities of scratches going on here. Old scratches, new scratches, deeper scratches, and more shallow battering of the gun. One thing that is really effective is to take these darker areas and then just put in really bright scratch lines. It's going to, be a real big value difference, and it just draws attention and makes our rifle more alive and not as boring as if everything will be perfect. And like I said, having these bright scratches across a darker area just draws the eye because the contrast is so high, and that's what we want to do. Tell a story and draw in the viewer. I keep repeating the steps, and if there is no edge here that I can just drag my brush across, I need to create my own reflection line, like on the back of the rifle here, on the white part on the back. And I do that by adding lines, just a vertical line that I kind of scribble on, and then I extend scratches, and then I scribble on the middle line again, and I'm just creating the illusion of light catching on to this area and simulating how it would reflect on a structure like that. For the next step, I'm going to make some of the panels a bit darker again. So basically it's a shading, so everything that faces down in a panel is going to be darker, and I'm using dried bark, which is a brown tone, a darker brown tone, and I'm mixing in a bit of black to make everything even darker. Back in the days, people used Vallejo smoke for this. I just feel like we don't really need to confine ourselves to just one color. We can mix our own shade colors to bring variety, or to bring some variation into the colors, in this case white. Because as you know, white is never just white. We have darker areas in there and brighter areas. And sometimes white items just change color and get dirty. And this is what we're trying to simulate here. Again, I'm glazing over the gradients that I initially painted, so if they were still a bit rough, this final glaze is also there to draw the gradient together to make the gradient smoother. And you can see it both gets more intensity and it gets smoother. And this is exactly what we want from this step. Just look at how more intense and more interesting the white areas become, just adding that tiny bit of darker shadow color. Of course, sometimes the edges will get covered by the shadow color. So I'm adding some white lines, some white dots, scratches, just variety in those lines again, to bring the contrast back again. One last thing that I do is I mix a midtone, and where I feel like, again, we lost the gradient a bit, I'm just putting one glaze over the whole thing to unify everything, and it works pretty well. Okay, so for the black part, like I said, I want to find a bit of an interesting color, and I'm going to have some blue in there, and maybe some green, because of the way the bikini top looks. So I think that might fit, and blue, like I said, is going to be in the jacket and obviously in the hair. So yeah, I want to do it darker than the white parts, obviously. And this greenish blue also is going to probably look interesting with the orange part that I'm going to do. Still don't know where I'm going to do the markings. I wanted to do them just on the white, but maybe I'm going to pull it up like into the black too. But yeah, we'll see. So let's start again. And some of this green, which is moth green by Reaper. Again, I just want to find an interesting color. I don't want to start off with a black. I'm going to add a warm highlight color, so this ice yellow. And I probably want to use a bit more blue and just mix that in so that we get these more grayish blue highlights, because yeah, blue and yellow are these kind of secondary complementaries where you mix violet, which violet and yellow are primary complementaries, but you can mix violet obviously from blue and red, so you still have a bit of that in there, and they mix up to a bit of a more neutral gray. So let's see. That's maybe a tiny bit too intense. I'll dial that down. Sketch in the highlights, and then we will see. So what I'm doing here is you basically have to imagine me painting a lot of X's across the barrel of the gun. So just crisscross pattern, and I just drag it down so that leaves the middle of the barrel highlighted more intensely than the outsides, and this is exactly what I want to achieve. I'm putting in a lot of lines. You know, that area above the barrel just is a straight line, and I'm highlighting the upper area a bit more, just like I did with the barrel. And I'm picking out all the details, all the edges. This is a this is a great sculpt. There's so many details that we can just edge highlight. Apart from the overall light situation, just put in all the lines on the edges and it's going to look great. Some secondary lights. This secondary light in particular I feel like was important because it's on the outline of that cylinder and it's going to make everything a lot more readable in the final photos, for example. Again, I'm just working on all the edges and I'm putting my interpretation into those highlights apart from the edges. And then I just add more and more ice yellow. And I'm covering less area in the main highlights. And then I just keep on working on the edges. And I'm using that crisscross motion again. If we have some lines showing in this, I don't really mind. Again, we have a really battered, a really beaten up gun here. It's just going to give everything a bit more character. And I actually really like how the colors interact. It almost looks a bit blue. And I'm going to paint over this. I'm telling it right now. However, you could just take this color recipe and get a really nice looking gun. Almost like a blue steel. Again, there's so much detail here. The rifle almost paints itself. Just focus on all the edges. Draw in all the lines that you can, like I did here. So I just drew that line and then highlighted the middle area a bit more. And of course all the edges that face up are getting highlights too. One last value step. See how I just stipple on highlights. I just covered the tiniest area possible in those highlights. And of course all edges that face up. And again, just make sure those lines look sharp. Last highlight that I was using, again, just covering the very tiniest spots to increase our value contrast, especially on these higher up areas, because they would catch the most light. And all edges facing up too. Like I said, I really like that. It wasn't quite what I was looking for with the composition, so I changed that around, as you can see in the next segment. So to break this down, what I did was I was taking the highlights that I painted before as a value sketch, and I just was using diluted glazes of the green color here to glaze over the gradients, and it's making for an interesting color tone. I really like it. And like I said, we had the highlights and shadows from before, so using very thin layers just added some color and it made everything a lot more interesting in my book. Again, using this crisscross pattern, painting little X's across all the barrel, across all the shapes of the rifle, and they changed up the color to this rich greenish yellow, or it's kind of hard to point your finger at what this color actually is, but there's a lot of green and yellow in there now. Yeah, just keep doing that scratching motion. And actually here, if the brush splits a bit, it's actually good, because then you can do like even smaller lines. Definitely having this area be brighter, and then as we move down, just as I have a brighter highlight here and the white, and as we move down, yeah, everything gets a bit more muted and less intense. I'm sorry, less value, less bright. Okay, and then switching back to the ice yellow and going for these highlights again. And again, painting that line pattern here in my brush actually split a bit, and it's not really a big deal if you can see the lines. Like I said, we just want that extra structure in there, that texture. Those lines are fine. This is a gun that has seen action. And again, it's your world. You can draw the attention to where you want it to be. Just put in all the highlights where you want them to. For example, here on this longer flat surface, I just put a highlight in the upper third of that straight, line. Just putting it next to where the highlights would be on the barrels, on the barrel and the other cylindrical structures. Okay, so mixing a bit of black with magenta. I'm going to start using it for the and again, with all the yellow in the highlights, I feel like it's a good thing to have a complementary color in the shadows. A bit more black maybe. Yeah, to see how it gets richer instantly with this purple in the shadows. Okay, we're going to put in a few chips, and I'm starting with the white edges. We'll see how it goes and how far we will take it. So let's see. Like I said, I'm starting with the white areas that are somewhat scratches already anyway. So yeah, let's go. And I'm just using the tip of my brush, and yeah, I'm starting with these tiny dots, all arranged in a line. Don't want to overdo it. And yeah, I'm starting rather light. Can always make these wider if we need to, or if we want to. It's better to start more careful than too white, and that, yeah, can just make everything look kind of weird and unrealistic. So while I want the rifle to be banged up, I keep those chips rather refined to the edges. You could, you know, drag out these chips and paint some lines into the white panels, for example. You can really go crazy. Just always make sure you highlight the lower edges of scratches like that. I have, you know, scratches like that painted in some older PDF tutorials. Here I didn't want to go as crazy with them. I wanted them to be there to add a tiny bit more detail, a tiny bit more story, but I didn't want to, you know, have these scratches draw all the attention. So I'm keeping them rather confined and subtle. I'm also putting the odd dent into the green parts just to keep everything in line, and you know, it would kind of look weird if those were not banged up a bit too. Okay, and that's it. For the next part, I'm going to paint the orange marking, and I'm going to paint the cable on the outside. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next part.